2017 may well go down in the history books as a major turning point for Sega's Blue Hedgehog. After all, Sonic Mania helped usher Sonic back into the spotlight with a game every bit as good as the original 16-bit Mega Drive titles. It answered the question, was Sonic ever really good? With a resounding yes, and may well help push the series in a new direction. But really, this question was only ever really asked after decades of uneven Sonic releases. Sonic Team has released countless 3D Sonic games over the years, and in my humble opinion, many of them are actually quite good. Sonic Generations remains my single favorite 3D Sonic game to date, with its rich level design, gorgeous visuals, and loads of content. When Sonic Forces was announced then, the initial showing suggested that we might be looking at a proper follow-up to Generations, with a slightly different theme of course. What we ended up with, however, isn't exactly that, and it will be interesting to see how Sega processes the reception of 2017's two Sonic games. But this is a Digital Foundry video, so we're going to start with its best feature, the presentation. Sonic Forces is a gorgeous game with a great soundtrack. From the very first stage, it's clear that we're looking at the latest evolution of the internal Hedgehog engine, dubbed Hedgehog Engine 2 in this case. Truth be told, it's not a significant departure from Sonic Generations on the PC, but it does offer some great visuals on current generation consoles. The Hedgehog engine then is quite capable, offering support for features like pre-baked global illumination, advanced post-processing, and very large stages. With the speed Sonic moves, the engine's ability to render these huge stages is critical to its design. And Sonic Forces certainly offers all of this in spades. The lighting remains excellent here, stages stretch far off into the distance with minimal LOD popping, and we see great new special effects like water reflections in this stage, or some excellent shader work in this one. The only thing lacking this time is the removal of the excellent motion blur, which has been replaced with a much cheaper effect when using boost. Still, on the whole, there's certainly nothing to complain about with the visuals, at least in terms of raw asset quality. But Sonic Forces is available across a huge range of platforms including PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the Switch. The Xbox and PlayStation versions also boast enhancements for Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro right in the box. There's also a PC version launching alongside the console versions, but we didn't have access to it in time for this video. Unfortunately, when it comes to resolution, we start to run into some immediate questions. Firstly, on the PlayStation 4, you get a full 1080p presentation. It looks reasonably sharp and clean, no doubt, but if you move over to the PS4 Pro, the game still only runs at 1080p. In fact, placing the two versions side by side, you'd be hard pressed to spot any difference at all.
Together we can show the world what we can do. You are next to me and I'm next to you. Push me on through until the battle's won.
Sonic Forces may support the Pro, but that doesn't mean it offers anything in terms of tangible improvements. This is very much the same experience on both PlayStation consoles, and in that sense, it's very much like Prey, which was released earlier this year. The game's box does promote PS4 Pro enhancements, but the game itself does not appear to offer much in the way of real improvements. Even 1440p support would have been a huge jump here, as the image quality is not necessarily its strong suit, but alas, we get nothing. It's 1080p on both systems, and it looks the same. Which brings us to the Xbox One then. For starters, the standard Xbox One operates at just 720p, which is kinda surprising. We haven't seen this kind of gap between the Xbox One and PS4 since the launch of the system, and it's not a good thing at all. Xbox owners are receiving a dramatically lower quality image here, that's for sure. Thankfully, aside from the gulf in resolution, the two versions look otherwise identical, with the same texture and detail settings between them. So if you can deal with the lower resolution, it'll still look quite nice on the Xbox One. But what about the Xbox One X then? Well, thankfully I managed to get my hands on an X just as I was working on this video, and I have the results. Unlike the PS4 Pro version, Sonic Forces does feature a noticeable upgrade over both its base counterpart and all PlayStation versions. But the upgrade isn't maybe as consistent as you'd expect. Essentially, after going through 7 or 8 levels or so, we've determined that the Xbox One X version varies its resolution on a per-stage basis. It selects between two different resolutions, and at its best, it runs at 3200 by 1800, offering a massive jump in image quality over any other version of the game. but in the other stages the resolution is dropped back to the same 1080p that we've seen on PS4. Well, maybe not exactly the same. You see, there's a scaling problem here. Zoom in on any line and you'll notice inconsistent steps along its run. The image is poorly scaled from 1080p to 4K in this mode, and the resulting image is kinda messy as a result. Still, this kinda seems like a bug and one that will hopefully be fixed in the future, and from a normal viewing distance, it's not a huge problem. Just a little distracting when you go from the super sharp 1800p stages back to the improperly scaled 1080p ones. Ultimately though, in terms of image quality, Xbox One X definitely has an advantage over the other versions. Lastly, we have the Nintendo Switch. Unfortunately, in this case, we've had to rely on the demo version since we only found the Xbox and PS4 versions early. That said, the PS4 demo is identical to the final game, so we'd expect the same here with the Switch. The Switch version operates at just 720p, like Xbox One, which is not unexpected, but there's more to it than that. The actual detail levels are dramatically reduced in some cases. Looking at this scene, for instance, we see a huge reduction in visual quality and detail levels. Textures are pared back, geometry reduced, and the overall scene just appears much lower quality on the Switch. Green Hill looks closer, but again, lighting appears to be pared back in comparison. But the real difference stems from performance. On Switch, Sonic Forces runs at just 30 frames per second. Now, it's still a very stable 30 FPS at least, but it's ultimately not as smooth as we'd like. This feels more disappointing considering that Sonic Team has previously pulled off Sonic Lost World on the Wii U at 60 frames per second. With the downgraded visuals on Switch in place, Sonic Forces really doesn't look much better than this Wii U effort, yet it runs at half the frame rate. Of course, that game was built from the ground up for the Wii U, and this is just a port that they likely tackled within the past year or so it starts to make more sense, but that doesn't mean the results we're seeing here aren't disappointing. The game just doesn't run that well on Nintendo Switch, and when you combine the lower level of performance with the reduction in visual quality, you have the worst version of Sonic Forces by far. So if you are still interested in playing the game and have a choice, I would recommend avoiding the Nintendo Switch version of the game in favor of Xbox One or PS4. As for the other consoles, well, those too have their own quirks. Xbox One operates at 60 frames per second and manages to maintain this level of performance most of the time, but there's one major caveat: screen tearing. Sonic Forces uses an adaptive VSync solution, and when the frame time slips just over 16.7 milliseconds and then drops back down again, you get momentary screen tear. The good news is that this allows the game to remain very near its 60 FPS target most of the time, and the game feels ever so slightly more responsive than the triple buffered PS4 version, and certainly the 30 FPS Switch version. Still, as you can see, the tearing can prove quite distracting, especially during these side-scrolling stages. Unfortunately, these 30 FPS cutscenes do suffer from significant tearing at almost all times, in what appears to be an issue with the way adaptive VSync has been implemented. It's especially noticeable during the pre-rendered cinematics. On Xbox One X though, it's much the same thing, but things are definitely improved. The 1080p levels now all run without a hitch, offering a completely stable 60 frames per second experience with no torn frames or hitches. It looks and feels great to play during these moments. The higher resolution 1800p stages, however, can exhibit some noticeable slowdown and tearing in select circumstances like this. Fortunately, it's kept to a minimum most of the time, but it can be noticeable when it does pop up. Still, Xbox One X performance is largely excellent and a nice improvement over the regular Xbox One. PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro then exhibit a couple of other interesting quirks of their own. Firstly, the game runs basically the same on the Pro and PS4, and that overall level of performance is extremely stable, turning in a nice smooth 60 FPS at all times. In that sense, it feels like Sonic Team concentrated the bulk of its effort behind this version of the game. But if you wind up using sleep mode and return to the game over a period of time, you might start to notice some issues. Well, basically it's what you see here, a multitude of duplicate frames appearing at an almost regular interval. This results in a noticeable but slight stutter during gameplay. Closing the game isn't enough either. I had to actually reboot both systems and start the game fresh in order to solve the issue. After that, the game would then remain okay even while sleeping, but the issue seemed to inevitably rear its head over time. Not a good thing. So, when looking at all three versions then, it's safe to say that they each have their own issues, but ultimately, PS4 and Xbox One X offer the best experience here in terms of frame rate. You might run into some hitching issues on the PS4 or slight tearing on the X, but in general they both feel very good. The Switch version is fine for what it is, but honestly it's hard to go back to 30 FPS after experiencing it at 60, and the amount of tearing you get on the standard Xbox One can be a little bit distracting at times as well. Regardless of which version you play though, clearly the presentation is its strongest feature. The game itself is unfortunately somewhat of a letdown for myself. I'm a huge fan of the various post-Sonic 2006 3D games. Now, these games have their critics, mind you, but I greatly enjoyed everything from Unleashed and Generations to Sonic Lost World and Colors. I genuinely had hoped that Forces would deliver a proper follow-up to Generations, or at least something similar. Instead, what we ended up with feels more like a half-baked shell. The core mechanics are there, sure, and at its best it still feels great to play, but the level design and pacing ultimately left me cold. Most stages are very short, weighing in at just 1 to 2 minutes tops, and most of these stages focus on very simple boost to win mechanics. Rarely are you required to deftly navigate challenges, as in previous 3D Sonic games. Forces is simply afraid to challenge the player. Beyond that, large portions of these stages feel as if they were built from very simple building blocks, almost like it's Super Sonic Maker or something rather than a carefully designed platforming game. The elegance seen in Sonic Generations simply is not here. Still, while the game is certainly disappointing overall, I still managed to have a lot of fun with it at certain points. When it works well, but it's just not all it could have been. But ultimately, that's just my opinion on the game, and I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks after playing it. So, when it comes to version recommendations then, I'd have to hand it to the Xbox One X version first and foremost. While it does have a few issues of its own, it's ultimately the best looking version of the game overall and feels the most responsive to play. The PS4 and Pro versions then come in right behind that with great performance, but a maximum resolution of 1080p and that odd frame skipping bug that can pop up from time to time. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you found it interesting or useful in any way, be sure to give us a like, subscribe to us on YouTube, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.
Somewhere.